The wind begins as a low hum. It moves across the frozen earth, searching for a gap in the stone or a crack in the wood. Outside, the night is blue and heavy. The air does not just chill the skin. It presses against it. On the window pane there is frost. It grows in jagged, crystalline ferns that blur the world into a grey smudge. Everything in the landscape has gone silent, locked away by a cold that feels permanent. Then there is the door. You step inside, and the sound of the gale vanishes. In its place is a different kind of silence. It is a thick, weighted quiet. The air here smells of old wool, dried herbs, and the sharp, honest scent of burning oak. Your breath had been a frantic cloud in the night. Now it slows down. In the centre of the room there is an amber glow. The fire does not roar. It breathes. It is a steady, rhythmic pulse of heat. It pushes back the shadows in the corners. You can hear the occasional snap of a log as the sap boils and breaks. The light it casts is not bright, but it is deep. It turns the wooden beams of the ceiling into gold. It makes the heavy fabrics of the room feel soft. For us, warmth is a dial on a wall. It is an invisible current that flows through pipes behind the plaster. We forget that heat was once a physical thing. We forget that it had to be carried. Before the era of the switch, warmth was earned. It began in the autumn, with the weight of an axe in the hand. It lived in the ache of the shoulders after a day spent hauling logs from the forest to the woodshed. It was found in the careful stacking of cordwood. The logs were layered precisely so the air could circulate and the moisture could leave. To be warm in January meant you had been disciplined in September. Every flicker of that amber light represents a choice to labour while the sun was still high, a choice to prepare for the moment when the world outside became hostile. The fire is not just a source of heat. It is a ledger of work completed. It is the physical manifestation of foresight. You feel the warmth begin to seep through your clothes, reaching the skin of your neck and the tips of your fingers. The tension in your shoulders drops. The room feels small, but it feels safe. This is the sanctuary of the hearth. A fragile circle of light, held against a vast and indifferent dark. It is an invitation to slow down, to stop looking at the clock and start listening to the wood. We are stepping back into a time when survival was a quiet daily practice, a time when the simple act of staying warm was a victory. We will explore the quiet rhythms of those who live by the season, not the grand histories of kings or the loud clashes of war, but the small practical habits of ordinary people. These were the rituals that allowed a family to endure the long dark months without breaking. To understand this life is to move through a house that breathes with the weather. We will begin at the hearth. In those days the fire was not a luxury. It was the centre of gravity. It was the centre of gravity. We can almost smell it now, the sharp scent of burning birch and the heavy, lingering aroma of charred oak. The hearth was where the day began and ended. It required constant attention, a steady hand to feed the flames, a watchful eye to ensure the embers did not die. In the flicker of that light the world felt small, manageable, and safe. From there we move into the larder. This was the room of foresight. Here survival was measured in jars and hanging bundles. We can feel the damp chill of the stone floor beneath our feet. We can smell the pungent tang of brine and vinegar. There were rows of pickled vegetables, their colours muted by the dim light. There were slabs of salt-cured pork and wheels of hard cheese wrapped in wax. Every item in this room represented a day of labour from the previous autumn. The larder was a physical map of the harvest. If the shelves were full, the winter was an inconvenience. If they were empty, the winter was a threat. Finally, we step into the bedroom. This was the most honest place in the house. Without central heating, the air here remained thin and cold, even in July. Warmth was something you carried with you. We can imagine the weight of heavy wool blankets. They were coarse to the touch, smelling faintly of LH Narlin. We see the thick linen sheets, and the way a person would curl into a tight ball to preserve their own body heat. Perhaps there was a warmed brick wrapped in flannel at the foot of the bed, or perhaps a heavy quilt stitched from scraps of old clothing. In these rooms silence was not just an absence of noise, it was a blanket of its own. These spaces, the hearth, the larder, and the bedroom, were the three pillars of winter survival. They required a specific kind of discipline, a willingness to accept that comfort was earned through preparation. There was no switch to flip, no dial to turn. There was only the wood in the pile, the salt in the barrel, and the wool on the back. As we move deeper into this world, we will look at how these habits evolved. We will see how different cultures fought the frost with different tools. We will start with the very beginning. The first attempts to tame the flame and turn a cold shelter into a home. The earliest hearths were not about comfort. They were about survival. In the great halls of the Vikings, fire lived in the centre of the room. These were the long fires. They cast a flickering light across intricate wooden carvings on posts and benches. But these halls were often cold, and they were always smoky. The smoke rose to the rafters, clinging to every surface with a layer of grey soot. People huddled close to the heat, their backs to the draughty walls. In the corners, small round fires offered a few more inches of warmth. It was a communal existence. You lived by the flame, or you froze. For centuries this was the standard. The open hearth provided light and a place to cook, but it wasted most of its energy. Much of the heat escaped straight through the roof. To stay warm you had to remain within arm's reach of the coals. There was no such thing as a warm room, only a warm spot. Eventually the fire moved from the centre of the floor into the wall. The goal shifted. It was no longer just about keeping the frost at bay. Now it was about holding on to the heat. In Germany this ingenuity took the form of the tiled stove. These were not open pits of flame. They were massive masonry structures, lined with heavy ceramic tiles and thick brick. The fire burned inside a hidden chamber, heating the clay and stone from within. Once these stoves reached temperature, they radiated a steady, gentle warmth. This lasted for hours after the embers had died. It was a quiet revolution in domestic life. Heat became something that could be stored. A person could move away from the flame and still feel the glow against their skin. Further south, in the eastern Mehderte, Rhein-Inn, the hearth took on a different character. In the homes of the Mun Empire, heating became an expression of wealth and art. They developed wall-mounted fireplaces that functioned as sculptural elements within the home. These were not merely holes in the stone for burning wood. They were ornate installations, carved with precision to fit the luxury of the interior. The fire was framed by intricate patterns and expensive materials. This turned a basic necessity into a centrepiece. This transition marked a change in how humans viewed their shelters. The home was no longer just a fortress against the wind. It was becoming a place of curated comfort. The hearth had evolved from a smoky pit into a piece of furniture, from a communal necessity into a private luxury. As these systems grew more sophisticated, they changed the very shape of the houses people built. The walls became thicker to support the masonry. The rooms became more defined. And the relationship between the inhabitant and the cold began to change. The fire was no longer something to be feared or fought. It was something to be managed. Beyond the hearth, the house itself became a tool for survival. It was the first line of defence. In the early colonial settlements this meant building with what the earth offered: heavy brick, rough stone, dense wood. These materials did more than support a roof. They held back the wind. The architecture followed a logic of necessity. The houses stood symmetrical and steady. But the most vital feature was the pitch of the roof. It was built steep. This was not an aesthetic choice, but a practical one. In the deep winter, when the sky turned grey and heavy, the snow could not settle on these slopes. It simply slid off. The walls were constructed in layers, each designed to keep the interior air still. On the outside there was wood clapboard. These were overlapping planks that acted as a skin to deflect rain and ice. Beneath the wood lay tar paper and board sheathing. Then came the lath and plaster. This was a labour of patience. Thin strips of wood were nailed horizontally across the studs. Over this a thick mixture of lime and sand was pressed into place by hand. Once it dried, it formed a hard mineral shell. It was not an airtight seal by modern standards, but it provided a boundary, a place where the warmth from the fire could linger. Then there were the windows. In these homes the glass was often thin, single panes that vibrated when the wind pressed against them. To combat the draught they used storm windows. This was a second layer of glass installed on the exterior. It created a narrow gap of trapped air between the two panes. That sliver of space served as a buffer. It stopped the freezing air from touching the inner glass. It turned a point of weakness into a shield. Every detail was a calculation. Double-hung windows allowed for precise control of airflow. They let in a breath of fresh air without chilling the entire room. The heavy doors were fitted tight to their frames. Even the placement of the rooms mattered, grouping the living spaces together to share the heat. The inhabitants lived within these layers. They felt the difference between the biting cold of the porch and the tempered air of the hallway. They heard the wind rattle the clapboards, but they did not feel it on their skin. Survival was a physical calculation. The house did not fight the winter with power or machinery. It fought it with mass, with layers, with the simple physics of slope and seal. But shelter was only half of the equation. A warm room is a luxury if there is nothing to eat. To survive the long dark, the inhabitants had to look beyond their walls. They had to look toward the larder. The survival of the household depended on what had been gathered before the first frost arrived. It depended on the art of preservation. It began in the heat of late summer. The work was rhythmic. It was repetitive. They started with the salt. Coarse grey grains rubbed deep into the muscle of a slaughtered pig. This drew out the moisture. It stopped the rot. Then came the smoke. Hams and sides of bacon hung from the blackened rafters of the smokehouse. For days they sat in a haze of hickory and oak. The meat turned mahogany. It became dense. Then there were the jars, glass vessels filled with vinegar and brine. Cabbage was pressed into heavy stoneware crocks until its own juices rose to the top. This was fermentation. A slow, bubbling transformation that kept vegetables crisp when the ground outside was frozen solid. Carrots and beets were submerged in acidic baths. Their colours were muted by the liquid, waiting for a February morning. There were no thermometers. There were no chemical strips to test for acidity. There was only the eye and the nose. A woman would lean over a jar and breathe in. She was looking for a specific sharp tang, a scent that signalled safety. If the smell shifted, if it became cloying or sweet, the jar was cast out. The risk was high. Some toxins, like both, 2-linum, had no smell at all. They were invisible. But they relied on what their mothers had taught them. They relied on the community. They watched for the colour of the brine. They felt the firmness of a preserved root. This knowledge was not written in books. It lived in the hands. It lived in the memory of those who had survived previous winters. A slight cloudiness in the liquid could mean success, or it could mean failure. The difference was often a matter of a few degrees of temperature, or a pinch more salt. The larder became a library of survival. Each jar was a promise. Each salted slab was a day of life. The labour was gruelling, but it was quiet. It was a steady pulse of activity that mirrored the turning of the year. They worked until their fingers were pruned from the brine, and their clothes smelled of peat and smoke. As the days shortened, the shelves filled. The weight of the food grew. This accumulation was the only true insurance they had against the coming cold. It was a physical manifestation of foresight. They looked upon a full cellar, with its damp stone walls and cool heavy air. It was the knowledge that the family would not starve before the first green shoots appeared in April. The tension of the harvest shifted into the stillness of storage. The frantic energy of August became the patient waiting of December. They had done the work. Now they simply had to trust the salt, trust the smoke, trust the silence of the cellar. Some traditions look beyond the walls of the home. They look toward the landscape itself, to the peat bogs. A bog is a place of heavy water and black earth. It is a landscape that feels soft underfoot, yielding slowly to every step. To the casual observer it is merely damp ground. But to those who lived by the seasons, the bog was a tool. They used it for something as simple as butter. The process was practical. They took the butter, rich and salted fat, and packed it tightly into wooden casks. These containers were not meant for the shelf or the larder. Instead, they were carried out into the wild, wet reaches of the moor. There the people dug deep into the moss and the mud. They pressed the casks down into the cold Anna ROH bike layers of the peat. Then they covered them with earth and walked away. The bog provided a natural seal. Because the peat is saturated with water, it pushes out the oxygen. Without air, the microbes that cause decay cannot survive. The temperature remains constant. It is a steady, biting chill that mimics the interior of a deep cave. Under this pressure, time changes. The butter did not rot. It did not spoil. It simply waited. In some cases it was recovered months later. This happened when winter stores ran low, and the need for fat became urgent. The casks were pulled from the mud, the lids pried open, and the preserved gold was returned to the table. But not every cask was retrieved. Some remained in the dark. They stayed beneath the heather and the rain, while empires rose and fell. They slept through centuries of frost and thaw. When archaeologists eventually return to these bogs, they find these remnants. They pull wooden vessels from the black soil. Some have been there for thousands of years. This is bog butter. It is a physical record of a low-tech necessity. Some samples have survived for muha, LEN, preserved by nothing more than the weight of the earth and the absence of air. It is a quiet reminder that survival often depended on an intimate understanding of the ground. The people did not have laboratories or chemical preservatives. They had the smell of the peat and the knowledge passed down through generations. They knew exactly how deep to dig. They knew which patches of land would hold the cold. They trusted the earth to keep what they could not protect inside their own walls. The butter became a part of the bog. It turned a deep waxy hue as it merged with the minerals of the soil. It sat in total silence, shielded from the wind and the sun. It existed in a state of suspended animation, held fast by the grip of the mud. This was the patience of the old world. It was a willingness to bury their resources in the dark and trust that the land would give them back. When the frost finally locked the soil, the world stopped. The frantic energy of the harvest faded into a heavy white silence. For those living in the long shadow of winter, this was not a time for ambition. It was a season of forced stillness. Survival during these months was rarely a matter of luck. It was a matter of memory. It was the result of every decision made in August and September. The survival of the household depended on the foresight of the autumn. It lived in the salt-crusted barrels of pork. It lived in the scent of dried apples hanging from the rafters. It lived in the jars of pickled vegetables, their colours muted by the brine. To look upon a full larder was to feel a specific, quiet kind of peace. It was the knowledge that the hunger of February had already been answered. Outside, the environment became hostile. The wind pressed against the wood clapboard and searched for any gap in the seal. But inside, the architecture fought back. The houses were built for this pressure. Steep roofs were designed to shed the weight of the snow before it could collapse the beams. Walls of brick and stone held the residual heat of the day. In the bedrooms, layers of lath and plaster acted as a buffer between the living and the cold. These were not merely buildings. They were shells. Within these walls life contracted. The family moved closer to the centre of the home. The world shrank to the size of a single room. The heart of this space was the fire. It was more than a source of heat. It was a psychological anchor. There is a deep primal security in a fire that refuses to go out. To keep the embers glowing through the night was to ensure that the morning could begin. The rhythm of the day shifted. The labour became smaller and more deliberate. Mending wool socks by the light of a tallow candle, reading a book while the wind rattled the storm windows, listening to the house settle into the frozen earth. In this stillness the mind had room to wander. Without the demands of the field or the urgency of the market, there was only the present moment. The smell of wood smoke clung to the clothes and the hair. The air in the room felt thick and warm. It contrasted with the sharp, biting air that waited just beyond the door. This was the reward for the labour of the year, a period of protected hibernation. It was a time to trust in the strength of the shelter and the depth of the stores. As the light faded early in the afternoon, the amber glow of the hearth became the only thing that mattered. The shadows grew long across the floorboards, and the house breathed in a slow, steady cadence. The fire has settled into a low, rhythmic pulse. The bright flames are gone, replaced by a deep red glow that clings to the ash. In this light the room feels smaller, more intimate. The heat no longer fills the air, but it remains trapped in the heavy stones of the hearth. Beyond the door, the hallway is a corridor of cool shadows. The floorboards feel hard and cold beneath the feet. But then there is the bedroom. Here the air is still. There is a scent of dried lavender and old cedar. On the bed the blankets wait. They are made of thick, coarse wool, woven tight to keep the heat from escaping. When you pull them up, they have a physical weight, a pressure that anchors the body to the mattress. Outside, the winter night has fully arrived. The wind moves through the bare branches of the oaks, a long and hollow sound. It presses against the wood clapboard walls. It finds the small gaps in the window frames and whistles, a thin and distant needle of cold. But the storm windows hold. The LAD and plaster walls stand firm. The house is a shell, a deliberate barrier between the frost and the skin. There is a profound security in this stillness. It is the reward for the labour of autumn. Every log stacked by the woodshed, every jar sealed in the larder, every stitch in the quilt, all of it has led to this moment. The preparation is over. The survival is won. The sounds of the house begin to change. A beam settles with a slow wooden groan. The wind shifts its direction, moving away from the eaves. The silence that follows is not empty. It is heavy. It is the silence of a place that is completely at rest. Your breathing slows to match the cadence of the room. The warmth of the wool blankets begins to seep into the muscles, loosening the tension of the day. The edges of the room blur. The amber light from the hallway fades as the door closes. There is nothing left to do. No one is waiting for you. There are no more fires to tend, and no more stores to gather. There is only the weight of the quilt, and the steady, slow beat of a heart at peace. The world outside continues its cold winter orbit. The snow may fall in sheets, burying the fences and silencing the roads. But here, behind the thick walls and the heavy curtains, the air remains warm. The thoughts of the day drift away like smoke from a chimney. They rise, thin and grey, until they vanish into the dark. You sink deeper into the mattress. The silence pulls you under. It is a soft descent, a slow surrender to the dark, sheltered, warm, asleep.